Hi, my name is Hasan Kesravi with Proteus Debate Academy. It's Medium Form Monday, and something has gone terribly wrong with the weather. It's 104 degrees. I don't know if I sound sweaty, but I don't know as a species what we have to do to make sure this doesn't happen anymore. I pray to Zeus, recycle. We just got to do it, folks. And today we're talking about writing good impacts. Let's begin with a little bit of an overview on impacts, which is also going to preview some of the stuff we're going to talk about in this video. Impacts are the most important thing in a debate. When you think about what your framework is, right, whether you're doing a value or you're doing whatever, right, you're telling the judge how they're going to make a decision later, what quality of your arguments they should be looking for. The impacts are when you present that quality that you've told them to vote on, meaning that you should be putting a lot more thought into it than I see most debaters do, which is just like a sentence that sort of blip, like this is good for the economy, this is bad for the economy. Cases should balance impacts. This is certainly going to be a topic for another later discussion, but suffice it to say right now that if you have one argument that's really low probability and high magnitude, you probably want to balance that out with a low magnitude, high probability argument. Or this is a little bit trickier to explain right now, but say you are talking about some sort of policy, there's some impacts that will be intrinsic to that. For example, if we are intervening in, I don't know, pick a country who upset us this week. Panama, they had papers, that was something about that. We intervene in Panama, and we're like, hey, you're doing something wrong with that canal for the 1 millionth time we've decided to say. Then the impacts that come directly out of that intervention are intrinsic to intervening. But there's all sorts of extrinsic impacts that happen as a sort of like more pulled back, greater scale things, right? Like it might not have anything to do with Panama specifically, but there are certain things that happen to the business sector when the United States is in conflict in general. Or there's certain things that happen with other nations responding and so on, right? So you might want to pick something that's really directly tied into the action and subjects in the resolution and something that's a little bit more outside of it so that you have a more predictable and a less predictable argument. And you also don't want to have the same impact repeated between arguments, right? You don't want to have two separate contentions that have all their own cards and links and then they turn out to just both be economy impacts, because then it only takes one answer to the economy impact to negate or refute both arguments. You want to balance it. So one econ, one politics, climate, health, military conflict, whatever. Impacts should be terminalized. Now you might be asking what this means. Terminalized comes from the 1982 sci-fi thriller The Terminalizer, and it doesn't mean anything. It's just a term we use. Impacts are the whole point of debate, so make them good. Now here is a tip for all of you trying to decide which coaches or which random people on the internet you're going to take seriously when it comes to debate advice. And my suggestion for a litmus test is the following. Everyone will say that an argument should be good, or they'll say an argument is good, or it is bad, or an impact is good, or it is bad. And my litmus test is how specifically can they describe the criteria for what makes an argument good, or what makes an impact good. And for me, the criteria for what makes an impact good is how directly comparable it is to other impacts. Now, that's really what you're asking the judge to do. You're presenting them your impacts, your opponent is presenting them impacts. And a good impact is one where a judge, regardless of their own biases, regardless of how much they understand about the world or their background knowledge or whatever, will be able to look at your impact, look at your opponent's impact, and confidently decide this impact is the one that I'm supposed to vote for. This is the one that I should vote for. That's what makes a good impact. Because if it's just something that sounds really important and your opponent sounds important and you don't really give the judge much to go on, you're asking the judge to make a complicated, unpredictable decision, and that's how you end up being unhappy with what the judge decided. So let's actually now talk about what terminalizing means. Terminalizing is reaching a point where your impact is important enough to win, and it's really a term that is used very, very commonly in debate. I don't really use it that much, and you'll see why, but it's important to talk about. And usually when people talk about terminalizing, they're referring to having a string of events that happen. Like first this happens, then this happens, and this thing happens, and then this thing that's my actual impact happens. And the reason they're doing that is because all those steps along the way, they have a hard time justifying why that is important enough for a judge to vote on. They don't really even know what language to use to explain why an impact is important enough to win around. So they just sort of try to extend the chain out until they reach something that just sounds like a no-brainer. Like, of course this is bad. Everyone dies from bio-extinction or a nuclear war or something like that, right? But you're not always going to have very good, confident links getting you there, and then every extra step you take to get to whatever is going to be your terminal impact is going to decrease the probability of your argument quite substantially. So instead, what I recommend is still play that chain of events game a little bit, but then you can end it earlier as long as wherever you decide to terminalize, you're doing what I call quantifying and qualifying your impacts. Let's get into what that means. To quantify an impact is literally to use numbers, to make it measurable. So you're just adding a quantity to your impact. Now, this is a very simple example of this. You would want to do more than just this, but listen to the difference between talking about an impact affecting North Koreans to it affecting 24 million North Koreans, which is the population of North Korea. Think about the difference between saying something improves the economy and something is a 5% increase in the GDP according to so-and-so. Now, this is a more vague example. You would want to, and I have used much more specific examples of this, but to say tuberculosis is bad is essentially just begging the judge to not know what to do with that argument, but to explain that it's the deadliest disease epidemic in human history, which it is, does put it a little bit more into perspective, even though it doesn't present a very specific number. And what this does is it allows your impact to be comparable to similar impacts. In other words, if you're talking about improving the economy through doing the AF, and the negative is talking about how doing the AF actually hurts the economy in some other way, now the judge can actually decide whether there is a net benefit or a net detriment. This also avoids a wash. So without something like this, say there's 3 impacts, right? There's one econ improving, one econ getting worse, and then one like this is good because it makes everyone feel happy. Now, the judge might like econ arguments generally better, but if there's no way for them to compare specifically and confidently the econ up and the econ down, they're probably just going to call that a wash and want to make their decision on something simpler, on something that just has no real thing weighing against it. So you want to avoid washes, right? You don't want your arguments to just not be able to work for you. And because of this, it becomes pretty tough not to buy, right? Like if there's only 2 arguments in the debate, you say you generate $50 billion for the economy, and then your opponent says that you cost $10 million, it would take a phenomenally unpredictable judge, let's say, to decide based on those arguments alone that they think the $10 million cost outweighs the $50 billion benefits, right? So it just makes your debates more predictable, which is what you want. There's such a variety of judges, you can't possibly plan for every nuanced individual. So what you're going to do is you're going to want to write cases that anyone has to buy. And the more specific you get, better, the better, as long as the argument's good, right? Like if you're specifically saying this helps 7 people, that doesn't do very much for you. But generally speaking, the more you specify a good argument, the better you're able to use that. So now let's talk about qualifying. To qualify an argument is to compare the quality of it to the quality of another argument you're hitting. In other words, you're saying this type of impact is more important than another type of impact. So you're not saying how much of the impact happens, right? This is where you would hear arguments like, even if one life gets lost, that is worse than any amount of money that we make, right? So here's a couple like sort of examples of how you would qualify impact. You might say lives saved is more important than the economy, or helping the disenfranchised is more important than helping the economic elite, or improving healthcare is more important than what the founders would have wanted. What the founders would have wanted, incidentally, I don't know what it is about how we teach people in schools, but you hear all the time in beginners debating, like that being the impact of their argument, as though that somehow means something. Pretty much everything outweighs that, because you can't measure. Anyway, this is different from impact calculus. So you're not saying lives saved is more important than the economy because of probability or because of magnitude. You're going to use those terms later, but what you're talking about here is usually using some other different metric, which is what we're going to get into in a second. Ultimately, death is pretty persuasive. Now, not every topic needs to be talked about in a lens of life and death, but in terms of the grand scheme of total things that can happen to you, whether they're good or bad, most people agree that death is pretty much the worst. And it's a pretty surefire impact to go for. So if you're not having a death impact, you should at least be able to talk about how your issue relates to life and death. So if you're talking about unemployment, there's a great line in the movie The Big Short where a couple characters are celebrating having predicted the housing market crash and bet against it and made a bunch of money. And Brad Pitt turns around to them and he says,
"You have any idea what you just did?
Come on, we just made the deal of our lifetimes. We should celebrate."
You just bet against the American economy.
Fuck yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Fuck yeah.
Which means, if we're right, people lose homes, people lose jobs, people lose retirement savings, people lose pensions. You know what I hate about fucking banking? It reduces people to numbers. Here's a number. Every 1% unemployment goes up, 40,000 people die. Did you know that?
No.
Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
We were just excited. Just don't fucking dance.
that is great impact framing. Moving on. It helps if you know what impacts to expect from your opponent, because that way you can make a more direct comparison, right? So instead of saying lives is more important than everything, or improving healthcare is more important than everything, you can specify why it's more important than your opponent's arguments. And lastly, the whole point of qualifying impacts is to make it comparable to dissimilar impacts. Very often in debate, one side will say this helps the economy, and the other side says, yeah, but it hurts innovation. And then they're like, Judge, what did you think? Who wins? I don't know. How am I supposed to make that decision in a way that I feel confident about? You need to start making that analysis. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is great to talk about because it essentially is a hierarchy of impacts. It essentially just is qualifying impacts that could happen to people in a rank order of how much they matter. And these things, this ranking isn't based on magnitude or time frame or anything like that. It's based on human psychology. This is how much it matters to every human being. Now, if you don't know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's thousands of easy, free, cheap, quick resources. But suffice it to say that the way that it works is the needs are built up so that if you don't have a lower need met, you won't care about a higher need. So essentially, someone who is desperately in need of sleep, like hasn't slept in 5 days, will not care whether sleeping would embarrass them. At least not with a... I mean, if they do care about that, that is the basis for the diagnosis of a mental illness, right? A mentally healthy human being prioritizes things in this way. So let's think about how this relates to specific impacts. Well, the first stage is just basic human necessities: food, water, sleep. And these are basically your death impacts, right? And this is more important than everything else. But you probably already knew that death impacts were the most important thing. So now let's talk about the next step above that. These first two stages at the bottom are great grounds for impacts. So these are issues like poverty, housing, environment, energy, quality of health, and so on. Like, these are really important ways of framing arguments, and you should talk about your impacts as they relate to these issues and directly compare these issues to the issues we're about to talk about above it, and just say, like, these are just fundamentally more important. You can even cite Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Above that is things like, it's more social issues, but as far as like debate goes, that would include things like representation, family wellness, inclusivity. Very important, of course, but if you ask people how they rank things, generally they would prefer to be alive than, I know, like, was it Pancho Villa, live on your whatever, die in the so-and-so. But for most people, there is a psychological hierarchy that happens. So when you're talking about this tier, I would relate those issues farther down, because certainly representation is an issue of poverty. It is an issue of housing. Inclusivity is an issue of the quality of health and energy in the environment. So I would relate those issues farther down the pyramid rather than just sort of let them sit as the end of your point. Above that, you get things like education and job satisfaction and fairness, and the fact of the matter is that it doesn't really translate down as easy as you would think. People say, oh, education gets people out of poverty, and no. It doesn't hurt, except for student debt, which is a bubble that's going to burst and destroy our whole economy, and we're all going to die. But the link to getting an advanced degree and now you aren't in poverty anymore just isn't as strong as something like you have housing and now you won't die when it rains. This stage is just imaginary. And I don't mean in debate. I mean in life. There was one person in all of myth and religion who achieved the state of no longer needing anything and pyramid fulfilled, and that was Buddha, and he went to nirvana. Every other human being struggles to fill the top of that pyramid, and that's just because it's imaginary. Read Schopenhauer, you're never going to do it, right? As soon as you feel something, you don't want it anymore. It's different with food. Once you eat, you cannot want food anymore. But I don't know what's at the top there, that little trophy or whatever. As soon as you get that trophy, you'll just want something else. It's a very temporary, fleeting thing. So impacts that rely on that, this will make people feel good and happy and whatever, nobody's happy. That's meaningless. And then completely outside of the pyramid is what the founding fathers intended, because what the hell does that mean? So these are some questions that everyone should be able to answer about their impacts. That doesn't mean that you write all of this information into your case that you read out loud, especially in a shorter debate format like public forum, because you probably just don't have enough time. But these are things that you should be able to say out loud if you need to, in case you need to later in the debate. And this is your test for whether the impact you wrote is solid or not. If you can explain these things and the answers to these sound important, then solid. So the first question is, who is affected by this impact? Now you want to be as specific as possible here. You want to use demographic. A demographic would be something that separates groups of people, like race, gender, age group, health status, disability status, education level, physical location, nationality, whether they live in a rural or urban environment. Think about all of those aspects, and that's going to be important for the next question. How many of them are there? Now you know why it's super specific, because you're not trying to predict how many people die, because you're not going to find evidence for that, right? No one writes research like that. So the way you have to do it is you say, here's who is affected the most. Here's how many of them there are, and here is how this thing leads to death or leads to whatever bad things. Like, here's what happens to the people that are affected by this impact. And there you have a really solid chain of logic, because you're not trying to predict some vague thing happening to a vague number of people. So a great example would be, if you are going to argue that something's going to increase the price of insulin, you would say that there's 100 million people in the United States who are diabetic or pre-diabetic, which is true. I think 30 million are diabetic. So let's say there's 30 million diabetics, and the majority of those people are in poverty. And in fact, poverty is the leading cause of diabetes. So if the price of insulin increases, you get an X number that is no longer able to afford their insulin. And what happens to those people? They go to the grocery market and they can't afford their insulin and they stop buying food, or they can't afford their insulin, they go home and they die. In that sense, you're giving a very specific, and it also creates much easier pathos, because you're describing, single mothers of color living in areas where they can't buy vegetables, right? It paints a much more specific image of who you're speaking about. And we can talk about how every time we try to make systemic improvements, we know that it doesn't trickle down to certain minority groups, like Native Americans living on reservations that consistently live in like some of the worst conditions in the United States. Like, we just know that our economic booms don't benefit these people. So it's rare that we get chances to help them directly, and that is probably a reason to take that opportunity rather than for the 1 millionth time this year choose the vague majority over ever helping them. These are some ideas to help you with your impact writing. I hope they've been helpful, and I'll see you all tomorrow for 2 Minute Tuesday, if I'm still alive and haven't died from heat stroke.